Hello, and thank you for checking this out. This is the um, aggregate supply and aggregate demand discussion that we didn't get a chance to do because of technical problems on Thursday. I hope that you enjoy the following presentation. We're going to be looking at business cycles, the PPF, and the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model. And while they look like three different things, I'm going to be making the case that they are, in fact, the different perspectives and different ways of thinking about the economy. And so they're all referencing back to the gross domestic product, the price level, unemployment, whether we're in a recession, whether we're in a bubble, or whether things are chugging along at a sustainable pace. So let's put it all together at the end after we look at that. And this will prepare us for a good understanding of what the classical model is, the Keynesian model, and the different types of inflation, which we'll talk about on another day. But let's get into the business cycle. So this is the typical way that the business cycle is represented. It's a sine wave with a line, a trend line that runs through the middle, and it's showing a relationship between real GDP, which fluctuates going up and down, and over time. So while this is a simplistic way of describing the business cycle, it is a useful and gives some insights into what the actual business cycle is. It's true that the business cycle has its ups and downs. It's true that the economy goes through bubbles and those bubbles burst and we go into recessions and we hit bottom and then we go back up again. But more than that, that the overall direction of the economy is upwards. So if you back up and see it from a bigger perspective, and the little ups and downs of the whether on a daily basis or otherwise are not really those are the trees, and the forest is an upward moving economy. There's something else too, that if you'll notice that the troughs, the bottoms are over time are as low as they go. They don't go as low as the other lows prior. So while you do have recessions, the recessions bring the economy or cooling off the economy. It's slowing down. It's not as low as the lowest points from before. So we get used to a higher amount of growth. Now let's take a look at a different way of seeing the business cycle. And this is a better representation. What we have is more years that are growing than years that are shrinking. And along the baseline here, we have green zones or years that are growing years, and then the orange are the recessionary years. And we mentioned that a typical say over the last 100 years, we've had 14 recessions. So, and they've averaged about 18 months each time, some of them longer, some of them shorter. So we could say that a typical business cycle is about 5 or 6 years of growth, 1 or 2 years of shrinkage, followed by 5 or 6 years of growth, 1 or 2 years of shrinkage. So the momentum, there's more good times than bad. There are booms and busts, but we have an overall trend line that goes up. And the way that over time, we could say that any particular quarter was either an up quarter or a down quarter, and that would be put in sequence along this baseline right there that would track the movement of the GDP, which is an upward trend with fluctuation. So it's a very useful way to look at it. I'd also say that what's going on here is that people have a short memory, or there's enough folks that towards the top of the peak, there's enough folks that have an expectation that the economy is going to keep getting better and better, that they start to over speculate. They start to have take on more debt. They take on more chances. They're counting on overtime pay and extra, really good times, and in order for them to in order to explain why we go into these busts and what causes the booms is a irrational exuberance that takes place that causes the boom, and people overspend and overheat the economy, and it's inevitable that it's going to crash because the very behavior or momentum of the masses leads the bubble to too high a level, and it crashes. And interestingly enough, when things start to decline, fear and other kinds of momentum in the other direction causes things to overcorrect. And when it slows down too much. So if you think about the trend line, the reason we don't stay on the trend line, the reason why we have recessions is because we have bubbles. We have recessions because we have bubbles. We have bubbles because people start to have too much confidence that things are going to be stable and good and continue. There's a Nobel Prize winning economist named Stiglitz, who himself had a quote that says, "Stability itself is destabilizing." That when people can count on things being perfectly fine, they push the envelope, they make it a little bit more dangerous, more risk taking, and it causes the bubble, which then causes the recession. Okay. This is a great screenshot from the Fred website. This is the Federal Reserve of St. Louis, and they showed domestic gross domestic product, GDP, here in as of the second quarter of 2023, we had an annualized GDP of $27 trillion in the United States. This was updated September of 2023, which was still in the third quarter, so we don't have numbers here that are represent and include the third quarter yet, right? Not until they've crunched the numbers. However, what you see is I went back to just after World War II. You can see that the GDP in billions of dollars, or you might say like 4,000 billion is 4 trillion. So the economy didn't hit 4 trillion until just after the 80s, but the economy, or the amount of GDP that the country was producing, continues to increase. And then each of these shaded areas are periods that were recessionary. So we had growth followed by the striped area, and you can see that sometimes the growth lasted much longer than 5 or 6 years, and others it was shorter than 5 or 6 years. And you can see that some of these bands or stripes, or the gray stripes, are wider than others. The wide ones show long recessions. The one in the early 80s seems to be the widest one that's illustrated here. That one in 2008, you can actually see the GDP drop, and you can also see a decrease in the GDP there in 2021 with the COVID, right? So, but those are just blips on the screen. I think seeing it in perspective like this helps you to know that, because you lived the economy, saw the huge slowdown, saw the massive amount of damage that was done by the policies of the government, shutting everything down, and so it caused a major amount of disruption in the economy. But if you look at it from this perspective, you can see that it's something that we've recovered from long since, and it's higher, at least in terms of GDP. So that's a good way of thinking about it as well. This is an actual representation of the business cycle over a long term. Now, the other model that we talked about in the early part of the semester was the production possibilities frontier. I just want to remind you of what the basic is that every country has a trade-off of their production. Are they going to produce more capital goods to try to make our production be greater for next year? Or are we going to use those resources not to produce machines and infrastructure? Are we going to instead use our resources to make consumer goods? That's the basic trade-off. So, and what we see here is a framework for thinking about the decisions that countries make over time And in this particular illustration, we have PPF1, which stands for Production Possibilities Frontier 1. And in PPF1, a efficient use of resources would be to produce Y, because you're right on the line. X would be underutilization of resources, and Z would be impossible for PPF1. However, years later, because of investments in capital goods and an increase in the factors of production, the country might be facing a larger, bigger possibilities frontier. They might be able to produce something in years hence that they weren't able to do originally. So PPF2 is representing the new situation for this country, and that is going to mean that Z is now an efficient use of resources, Y is an underemployment of resources, and X is a very, very inefficient or underutilization of land, labor, capital, and resources. Okay, so now with that understanding, just a refresher, I wanted to, again, show you the framework. We got the capital goods on one side, consumption goods on the other, and let's go way back to a simpler time, way back to 1776. And that was the production possibilities frontier for the country. And the country decided, individuals, the government had very, very little play in the economy back in 1776, less than 3%. But the individuals that were making decisions decided to work hard at building a better life for their descendants and for the future. And they were not as interested in consumption goods. They're more interested in capital improvements. So they chose a point on the production possibilities frontier that was very heavy in capital production and very light in consumption goods. But it was a tiny economy back in 1776 compared to what we are now. So I'm showing that the production possibilities were all limited possibilities because it was there was a lot of land and there was a lot of potential, but there was not a way to fully use it, and there were all sorts of restrictions on the full utilization of those resources. So, because the country had chosen a more capital focused production possibilities frontier in 1776, by 1850, the economy had grown much larger. So what that's represented by this red line that's further out, that there's more things that are possible in 1850, more production. You could make more of everything in 1850 than you could in 1776. But again, you had to decide where you're going to produce. And again, the people of this country focused more on capital improvements rather than on consumption. That's where the star is showing. And as a result of that, 50 years later, we were the biggest economy in the world. And what we were able to produce was greater than anything we were able to produce before. And again, we had that same discussion. And because again, in 1900, we focused on capital improvements, then we grew the economy again. But by 1950, there was a shift in the focus, and there was more of an interest in and more behavior that was focused on consumption goods and less on building up the country and less on building up our productive capabilities and more focus on consumption. And so we chose a trade-off between the consumption and capital improvements that favored more consumption than we did in the early parts of our history, which meant that the growth, which did still happen because capital improvements lead to growth, right? And the increase in population leads to growth, and the economy was growing, but you can see that it didn't grow by as much, a smaller percentage from 1950 to 2000 than it did from 1900 to 1950, or actually any of the other times before, right? The economy was really doubling and tripling over a similar time period. So at this point, it had grown, but by not as much. And so, here in the year 2000, definitely there was a lot of focus on consumption and not so much on building up factories and infrastructure and so forth. And because of that, here in 2023, we have a larger economy than we have before, but our ability to produce has only increased by a little bit. Our frontier, or our maximum production, has been slowed down because of the choices we have made in the past. So the question I have for you is, where are we going to go from here? What combination? Where's the focus? What people are they focusing on? Saving, investing, starting companies, focusing on infrastructure and building up and making, connectivity and focusing on increasing our ability to be more productive in the future. Many of my students they're focused on exactly that. They're sacrificing quite a bit in their years in college in order to be more powerful and more productive in the future. But how about the country as a whole, right? All these individuals' decisions will then result in either a tomorrow that has a pie about the same size as this pie that we're slicing up now, or we'll have a larger pie, a larger economy, more productive capabilities, and a brighter future. Those are the decisions that every generation must face and answer. But they are answering that to the peril or the benefit of the next generation. So when we look at the production possibilities options and their limits, right, we understand that because it's a frontier, because it's totally impossible to have production outside of the frontier. But you might say, given this current level of technology and land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship and so forth. But I wanted to show you a distinction between the institutional production possibilities frontier and the physical production possibilities frontier. Every country has this. Some countries have institutions which allow a more efficient use of all of their resources. And so those countries that are best in their institutions have an institutional production possibility frontier that's almost as great as their physical production possibility frontier, what they're actually able to produce. Now, I'll give you an example. There's 168 hours in the week. If you really wanted to work very, very hard this week, you could work all 168 hours, but it would come at a price. So realistically, you can't do 168 hours this week. You can't do it. And you couldn't really even come close to 168 hours of work this week, because you have to do certain things that are just part of the system, if you will. In this case, the biological system of needing sleep and other biological things. So there's a difference between the hypothetical production you could be doing and the actual or realistic production that you could be doing. It does explain, though, during certain really busy weeks, why you could produce more than you normally could, even though it's not sustainable. The same is true for countries. So because the institutions that we have, for instance, a 40-hour work week is one of our institutions and restrictions. So it limits the amount of production we can do, because people that are extremely efficient at what they do often don't get hired for more than 40 hours a week. And if you wanted to do more than that, you might do that occasionally during, especially bubblicious times, we might say, during the bubble. During a special time, you might be able to do more than that, and then you get overtime and so forth. But often, if you're just restricted by that piece. Some countries have massive amounts of regulations, and so it slows everything down, how long it takes to get a business going and how long it takes to get things connected. Some countries have very unreliable energy sources, so that there's shutdowns and blackouts and brownouts and so forth. So it slows things down, and it limits the amount of production that they have. There's perhaps all sorts of distrust, and so they have in some countries, so they are not able to trade with each other, except with people in their own particulars, some kind of in-group, and so it limits the amount of trade. Lots of institutions, and so some countries have a very inefficient production possibilities frontier, and the way that they could improve it is by improving their institutions. All right, but the reason I show that to you in this particular day and this slide is because we have to explain how it's possible for us to produce beyond our institutional PPF or inside our institutional PPF or on our institutional PPF. And the only way to explain that is that somehow, even though we think of producing beyond the PPF is impossible, and it is, it's only impossible to produce beyond the physical PPF. You can, in short bursts, in the short run, produce between the institutional PPF and the physical PPF. So the little diamond here is showing an unemployment of resources. The red shows the efficient use of resources given the institutional PPF. The green area shows a bubble part, that is a temporary overheating of the economy, and this little thought bubble outside the PPF is impossible. Now let's talk about aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is another model, and we're going to superimpose this with aggregate supply as well, but I wanted to start with aggregate demand because it makes it's easier to get it. It's easier to think about the demand portion. And what we're doing here is showing a relationship between the price level on one side and gross domestic product, also known as production levels, along the x-axis. And the relationship for aggregate demand is that the country's production will be in high demand. There'll be a lot of production over here on the right side of the graph. There'll be a lot of production if the price level is low, right? And then what they're explaining there is when the price level is low, you have a high amount of buying power and you'll buy more. Not only will you buy more, but people outside of the country will also come to, let's say, the United States. If our price level is low, people will buy more from us, right? Europeans would prefer to buy American wine if American wine is just as good and a lot less expensive. Canadians would prefer to come to America to buy sneakers here instead of there if the price level was low. Conversely, on the aggregate demand curve, when the price level is high, right, and if in the United States the price level is high, then the aggregate demand is low. And by low, I mean it's over on the left side of the curve. There'll be less demanded of production from the United States if the price level in the United States is high. That's the aggregate demand curve. The aggregate demand curve can move around. So what I did is show the blue line is what aggregate demand was in 2004. Then we went into kind of a bubble phase, and that moved the aggregate demand to the right. So by 80, the aggregate demand in 2007 had moved to the right, and that shows an increase in aggregate demand. And then we went into the Great Recession, which was a decrease in aggregate demand, and that dropped down to the green line, aggregate demand in 2009. Just a little reminder that the gross domestic product is made up of, for the year, consumption, investment by businesses, government spending, and then the plus or minus you add exports and subtract imports. So if we buy $10 billion from China and they buy $2 billion from us, then the net effect is a 8 billion less to our GDP than when we calculated it, because the amount of the net exports is the difference between what we're buying from other countries and what they're buying from us. So and consumption is consumer spending, investment is business spending, and government spending is both state, local, and as well as federal. So now aggregate supply has a different relationship. You see, it's a vertical line. The long run aggregate supply is a perfectly vertical line because it's unaffected by the price level. Think about that. Our ability to produce has nothing to do with the price level. Our ability to produce has everything to do with our land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. If the price level is high or low, what we're able to produce doesn't change because the physical PPF doesn't change either with the price level. But there is a short run aggregate demand or a short run aggregate supply curve, which is upward sloping like other supply curves that you're familiar with, because in the short run, our production does change with prices. What happens is as the price level rises, that's a signal to the suppliers to produce more. And as they produce more, they because the price level is higher, the total amount of GDP temporarily goes beyond the long run aggregate supply curve, that goes beyond the PPF. At low price levels, that's a signal to suppliers to produce less than what they could because it's a signal that the economy is slower, and so they're not going to produce as much if there's less there. So that's why the short run aggregate supply and the long run aggregate supply have a relationship like that. In reality, it's kind of both, right? There was a new model that came out called the kinked aggregate supply curve. Try not to pay attention right now to the aggregate demand curves, which are slowing down, and just take a look at this kind of J-shaped LRAS curve. That stands for long run aggregate supply, showing a relationship between the price level and real GDP. What they're saying is that there's a section of the supply curve which is vertical because it's limited by our physical PPF and by our institutional PPF. We can't produce above a certain amount of production. Our GDP is limited, but along a certain stretch, it can be influenced by the price level. And then below a certain point, you have a horizontal supply curve because there's a certain amount that's going to be produced irregardless of the price level as well. That's right, Bueller. That's the economics class. So I'll just throw that in to keep us going on the piece. Now, to show how the long run aggregate supply curve grows, I went back to those same years and I said, this is the relationship here. Our long run aggregate supply curve was very limited because our production possibilities were very limited back in 1776. But again, because of increases in our factors of production, we were able to produce more and have a higher GDP in 1850, 1900, 2005. So as we've moved along, we've advanced the long run aggregate supply curve to the right. And the way I thought this would give you a solid way of thinking about what's happening as we grow the economy, what happens to the long run aggregate supply curve, it moves to the right. And we can have supply shocks and war. We lose things, right? But this is showing growth. I thought I'd show you kind of an example that you might see. You definitely see this question on the concept exam. So as our productive capacity of the country increases, like I just showed you in that prior slide, we have the long run aggregate supply curve moving to the right. That's the increase of productive capabilities. Now the aggregate demand curve is moving to the right as well. We see it kind of moving in an upward to the right, and that's showing that the aggregate demand is increasing. So we were at a price level of P1 and an output level or real GDP of Y1. And then because there was an increase in productivity, we switched over to Y2. But because there was an increase in demand, we go up here to P2. So that's how that moves. That's the nature of that positive growth in both supply and demand on the aggregate level. I probably should have said this earlier, but the word aggregate means just everything all together, just grouping it all together. It's very much a macroeconomic concept. Okay. So let's take a look at a historic example. In 1920 in America, we had a certain level of productivity that which we could call the long run aggregate supply curve in 1920, this green LRAS curve. And we had a certain amount of demand. It was right after World War I. Well, during the 20s, early part of the 20s, we had a major increase in population, a lot of immigration, a little baby boom. We had major increases in demand. People were also, it's the roaring 20s. There was a major expectation of higher amount of consumption as well. So there was a major increase in aggregate demand going from, say, 1920 to 1927. And if our production capabilities had stayed the same on the green line, then we would have seen production actually staying the same, but prices going higher. But what we did see in 1920 to 27 was an even greater increase in our productive capability. So our long-run aggregate supply curve shifted far to the right, while the aggregate demand curve was increasing by so much as it was. Our ability to produce was outpacing our desires to have more. And so the effect was that there was a major increase in gross domestic product, a real boom during the 20s, at the same time as there was a drop in price and things were getting less expensive. So we moved from, well, actually, I think I animated this. Yes. So in 1920, that was the price level, and that was the GDP. But in 1927, because there was both a shift in aggregate demand and aggregate supply, we had a drop in the price level that dropped to there, because that corresponds with that particular point right there. So that price level is the price level that corresponds with that intersection point of the long run aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve, both for 1927, as opposed to what it was before. So, and the GDP moved up as well. Thought you'd enjoy that. Little extras for you. Long run equilibrium is a place where the intersection happens of the short run aggregate supply curve, long run aggregate supply curve, and the aggregate demand. That point where they all come together is what we call the ASAD long run equilibrium. And it's always a test question as well. So it's just kind of shows that you understand what you're looking at. RGDP stands for real gross domestic product. PL stands for price level. Let's see what a recession looks like on all three models, shall we? So here with the long run equilibrium model, right? So we see the price level, real GDP, very familiar, except that I've added the short run aggregate supply curve, the aggregate demand curve, and the long run aggregate supply curve intersecting there. And if we were in equilibrium, we'd be right at that point. But because we're in recession, the economy is sick. And the way we show that sickness is to show that there's production levels at one of these red diamonds. We're either at the red diamond on one or the other, depending on what caused it, whether it was a decrease in supply or demand. But it's to the left of the long run aggregate supply curve, showing that we're in a recessionary gap. On the three models I'm talking about is this ASAD model, the business cycle model, and the PPF model. So when we see a downward slope on the business cycle, we know that we're heading into a trough, and that's a recession. And if we see production that's within and not touching the PPF, we know that's a recession. And all three of these models are all showing a recession. And they just show it in different ways. And so when you're looking at one or the other, one of those probably intuitively makes a lot of sense to you. And you say, oh, yeah, that's the one that I like to look at. You go, good. Then look at that one and then understand that the other two are helping you to see something about a recession that's also true. So that's the GDP in the model. That's the recession in this model. And that is the GDP and recession in that model. If you want to show a bubble, we're showing it with these little green stars, right? Similar idea. We have the production is high above the long-run aggregate supply curve, or you're in a bubble. That's indicated either of those places. If you're in a high peak, that's a bubble. It's going to burst. That's what it looks like. And if you are producing within the delta between the institutional PPF and the physical PPF, then you are having that as well. Now, let's wrap this up with a couple of questions. Suppose aggregate demand increases. Well, you start off in equilibrium, as we have indicated here, and then something happens to cause aggregate demand to increase. Maybe the government borrows a bunch of money and they increase their spending, so it increases G. Maybe the people start saving less and spending more because they think that good times are ahead and they don't need to save. So that would increase aggregate demand. Maybe there's a whole lot of buying from other countries, buying from us. That would be an increase in aggregate demand. We move then from equilibrium into a situation where the price level goes up and GDP production, right, increases as well. But it's a bubble because it's above the long-run aggregate supply curve. It wasn't a fundamental shift in aggregate supply. It was just a temporary increase in short-run aggregate supply, which leads to what is called an inflationary gap. And that higher price and the higher production then leads to a most possibly a decrease in the short-run aggregate supply curve, because the producer is realizing now that not only can they sell for a higher price, but they got to buy everything at a higher price. The cost of labor is higher, the cost of energy is higher, the cost of materials is higher, the cost of rent is higher, the cost of everything that goes into supply is higher. And so it comes back to the long-run aggregate supply curve, and then you have a shift from those higher price levels that actually causes a decrease in short-run aggregate supply, and you're back to a higher price level, but back to your normal production. The economy eventually returns to long-run equilibrium at a higher price level. Okay. If you think about it, aggregate demand has increased over the years, right? So we're back to these same years that I showed you earlier before. And back in those days when aggregate demand was, well, when our long-run aggregate supply was very small relative to what it is now, our aggregate demand was also small. And the price level and production was in equilibrium. Then over the subsequent years and decades and centuries, we've had these increases in aggregate supply, but we've also had increases in aggregate demand. So that in more modern times, we even have not only a great amount of aggregate demand, but we also have a higher price level than before. There was stable prices in those early years, less stable prices, higher amounts of inflation now due to more government spending, higher amounts of aggregate demand in all those areas, especially consumption and government spending. Thank you very much, and have a fantastic time doing these aggregate supply and aggregate demand curves. Take care.